Welcome to the Man Rules Podcast. If you're looking to live with more intention, build connection, and live a more authentic, meaningful life, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Dan Griffin. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that they keep changing the rules for us men without telling us. So each week, I just throw out the rule book and cover the tough topics about the real issues that men face. At the end of the day, I'm not here to tell you what kind of man you're supposed to be. I'm here to help you make your own rules and become the kind of man you want to be. So let's jump in. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Man Rules Podcast. I'm excited to have my guest Rick Belden here joining me, and I'm excited to have this conversation. It's going to be an intense conversation, folks, so I'm just going to prepare you. But this is part of our dedication and our focus this month of Father's Day, on fathers and the incredible impact that fathers have on us positively, negatively, and celebrating all of that in this journey of being men, fathers in our own rights, our experiences with our fathers. And Rick is a man who's done incredible work and has been doing incredible work from his own place of vulnerability and his own sharing through a lot of art, through a lot of personal essays, and has really just been a voice for multiple decades in really challenging the narrative about men, and particularly around men and trauma and just how we share ourselves as men in this world. So Rick, a big, friendly, and grateful welcome to you for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for inviting me to participate. I'm honored to be here, and I really look forward to our discussion.
As do I. So when you and I were going back and forth and talking about what we could focus on, and there's lots of areas where we could go, you mentioned that what if we were to focus the conversation on this whole idea of a father wound? And I thought, boy, you know what? That's perfect. It's going to be intense, but it's perfect. So why don't you set that conversation up? What exactly do you mean when you say a father wound?
Sure, that's an excellent place to start. I'm actually going to read something that I wrote a while back, and it actually was written about the mother wound, but in these terms, they're interchangeable. Here's my definition that I use. A father wound may be thought of as injury to the psyche of a child resulting from significant dysfunction or disruption in relationship with a father. In some cases, it is a result of a father's absence or unavailability due to death, illness, adoption, or other circumstances that dramatically separate the child from the father. But more typically, a father wound is a complex of injuries to the child's psyche received over many years, often as a result of the father acting consciously or not out of his own woundedness.
That, for our listeners, that alone is a pretty heavy definition, in the sense that it's a wound that can be generational, it's a wound that can be invisible, it's a wound that we're conscious of or unconscious of, and it's a wound that can be passed on.
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing I think is important in that is the phrase that I use, a complex of injuries to the child's psyche received over many years. This kind of goes to the question that adults that are in the process of recovering from childhood trauma often get, which is, why aren't you over this yet?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because real men don't have trauma. Let's just settle that right now.
Right. And the kind of corollary to it is that basically you just need to make up your mind to get past this. And, the point being that these kind of parental wounds, in the way that I look at them, it's not typically the result of a single incident. It's typically the result of often daily incidents, multiple daily incidents over a period of years, over the entire childhood, all the way into the teens, the late teens, whenever the child leaves home. So the idea that you can just make up your mind or will it away, or you just need to grit your teeth, or you just need to try harder, is very, very counterproductive, and actually drives people backwards, because the part of that package that's even more painful is being shamed, which men are very, very prone and very vulnerable to. And so if you have somebody who's trying to work through a complex, difficult, sort of iterative process of being wounded, and people around him are basically shaming him by saying you should be done with this already, that's going to drive him in the wrong direction. It's not helpful at all.
And of course, the tendency through the man roles and just the way that men naturally protect themselves is to view this as some form of weakness, or is to not see this as something that's necessary. You know, what I hear all the time is like, I was 6. You know, that was a long time ago. I was 6, I was 7. You know what? I was a pain in the ass as a kid. I deserve to be treated that way. God, if I had to raise me, I would have beat the shit out of me too. Or that's what helped me become a man.
Yes. In my family, it was, well, this is normal. Everybody's family is like this. So, and I want to actually respond to what you said with another quote that I really like. It's by a guy named John E. Sarno. And he says, the reason childhood things are a factor is because the unconscious has no sense of time. In other words, things that happened to us when we were 8 or 10 years old, if they're emotionally powerful, are still there at the age of 40, 50, 70, or 90. And I would add, in addition to emotionally powerful, I would add unresolved in some fashion. Yeah, so that thing you said about like, well, I was 6 when it happened, now I'm 26, 36, 46, 56. That doesn't matter in terms of the way that your unconscious perceives its experience.
That is such an important point for our listeners. I mean, regardless of where you're coming from as you're hearing this information, and I talk about that a lot on the podcast, is that the limbic part of the brain doesn't have an understanding of time, the unconscious doesn't have an understanding of time, and that the impact is significant. And when men feel safe enough to really talk about their experiences in certain relationships, especially their most intimate relationships, you know, you can really begin to hear how these have been affecting them. The first is feeling safe enough to be able to admit it to themselves, let alone anybody else.
Yeah, absolutely true. The other thing that I would point out about these sort of father wound that we're talking about, and the way that I look at it, is that it's really a form of conditioning. So when a boy has negative experiences with his father, either because the father's absent, he's unavailable, he's angry, he's distant, he's extremely harsh, he isn't able to understand the boy's experience. As I said, these things tend to recur. They tend to happen over and over and over again. And that's how a child's mind gets conditioned to perceive the people around him, to perceive relationships, to perceive the world, to perceive himself. And as a result, he lays in a whole lot of thought patterns and a whole lot of neural pathways that basically drive him in very specific directions that as a child will seem like this is the safe way to go. This is the way to get what I need. This is the way to minimize the pain and the rejection and the shame and the vulnerability that I feel that feels extremely unsafe. And so when we're talking about addressing father wound in an adult male, we're talking about layers and layers of patterns of experience, patterns of feeling, and patterns of thinking. I don't say that to discourage people and make it sound like it's just so huge that it's impossible, because it's not. You start at the top and you work your way layer by layer, and you get better over time, and you get more self-aware over time, and you develop more of a capacity to examine your thoughts and your behavior and why you make the choices you make and what might be driving that. And then you have the option, because you're an adult and not a child anymore, to make different choices and to draw different conclusions about the things that happen in your life. But again, it's a process. It's one of those, again, it happens over time. So you unravel it and you heal it over time.
You know, you just said a lot there, but I think one of the key takeaways is this idea of this consciousness that we can help to develop. And, you know, it's quite personal. It's a process. You know, it's about the journey, right? It's about the layers of it, and let the process guide you, and not feel as though once you step into that work, you know, that it has to look a certain way or has to go in a certain amount of time. You know, from my own personal experience, right? And I think that's possibly what will help this come even more alive for our listeners, is yours and my own personal experience. So one, I used to have a really hard time talking fairly, I would say, about this topic because of the level of pain, grief, and rage I had around my own father wound.
Yeah, I absolutely understand what you're saying.
And so what's been really important to me, and I think really important to my father and his memory, he was 54 when he died of alcoholism. I was 22. It was a very, very difficult relationship for both of us. You know, that's created an amazing, difficult wound before his death and after his death. And I've done a lot of work around that to come to the place. You know, I'm not one of those people who believes you go into therapy and the therapist, you know, says at the beginning, well, you know, your father did the best he could. You know, that I think that's a very irresponsible approach to therapy that some people do. I think through a lot of hard work, you can come to realize, like, now at my place, I understand my dad did the best he could. Like, he really did. But for a therapist to tell me that when I first started working with them and hadn't been given permission to feel the grief and the rage that is very merited for the experiences I had as a child, I think, you know, that's a component of this work and why we need to more effectively train people in how to deal with this and handle it, because so many therapists are walking around with their own father wounds that they haven't dealt with.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Dan. And you know that you know, we're kind of getting into we're already getting into the things that people tell other people that are supposed to be helpful that aren't helpful at all. And that, you know, that I've heard that before. You know, your father did the best he could, and the way that I came to interpret that, and my answer when people would tell me that would be, yes, he did. He absolutely did the best he could, and he hurt me terribly.
Yes, and it wasn't good enough.
Right. And so I think that, again, that's when, if you're in a kind of scenario that you're talking about, where if a therapist tells a man who's just getting started with this work, your father did the best he could, that is very easily interpreted as you really don't have anything to complain about.
Right.
That's a perfect way to shut somebody down and maybe set them back for a couple of years.
Or when the man comes into therapy and says that, like, you know I've been having some anger issues with my kids or with my partner, you know, and my partner thinks this is about some of the stuff that happened with me and my dad, but, you know, my dad did the best he could. And that's kind of where they start as well.
Right. And I would, you know, in this moment, I would be prompted to ask him, and how did that work out for you?
Yeah. And tell me more about that. What did the best he could look like?
Yes.
Like, give me some more background around that. And you know, I mean, there's a lot of baggage. I mean, don't you think our culture has a father wound?
I think that's really evident. Yeah. I wouldn't dispute that at all.
And so we've got this collective father wound. So we got all these negative and biased ideas about dads. Sometimes they come out, sometimes they don't come out. And then we've got these personal experiences. And I still find in these trainings I do where I work with professionals around some of this and just beginning to get them to just begin to open their eyes around some of this. It's amazing how compelled people feel to say, oh, I loved my dad. My dad was the best. I hear all this stuff about dads, but my dad really was the best. He couldn't have loved me more. And so, like, you have that one group that is, like, so afraid that if they say something that didn't work in their relationship with their father, that somehow it betrays the fact that their father might have actually been a really good father and still obviously made some mistakes. And then there's the other side, like me, like I used to be on, which is my father was the worst person ever. He was a horrible blah, blah, blah. And not being able to have a better appreciation for the gray. What do you think about that when, like, the father wound shows up in those different personas?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, culturally, for me, one of the ways it shows up is it just seems in this culture that every generation of men as a collective kind of sells out the next generation behind them.
Mm.
And so the next generation behind them doesn't trust them, because they tend to see them as, if they can even see that they ever had ideals at all, they see them as a bunch of men that just basically threw their ideals aside, didn't take care of them. So that creates all kinds of repercussions. And in terms of kind of individually, for me, I never stopped loving my father. I hated the fact that I loved him, because it was so difficult to hold the love that I had for him with all the anger and the pain and the hatred that I felt for him at times. But I think one of the first positive steps that I made was to be able to give myself permission to hold those supposedly contradictory emotional states at the same time. So for me, it was, I went through a long period where I was very angry with him. I was still trying to get his approval. And it took me a long time to let go of that and to begin to see him as a separate person who had a life that was a whole lot bigger than just his life as my father. And that was a big key for me to begin to actually release him and release the kind of stranglehold that I had on him in my mind in some ways, that someday I was going to get what I needed from him.
That is such an important point, is that in the trauma of the pain and suffering, and in that narrative that we create about our fathers, one of the wounds I think that gets created is our failure to allow our fathers to be human.
Yes.
And that's exactly what you're saying. I mean, that's so well said and so important, that it's like, but my father was a professional. My father had friends. My father had his own past. My father had his own family. My father was not only my father. He had another child. He had his partner. What was his life like in its totality?
Exactly. And he had a life before he was ever your father, before
Right.
he ever met your mother. And again, I never say, nothing I ever say should be characterized as excuse or rationalization for anybody's bad behavior. I think one of the ways to get to a fuller understanding of somebody where you can actually forgive them, which is your choice, you may choose not to, is to be able to see them more and more as a whole and separate person. Because I think part of what happens to us as children is, number one, your parents are basically gods when you're a child.
Right.
You can't conceive of them as other human beings for all kinds of reasons. And there's also, I know at least in my mind, for a long time into my adulthood, I had this sort of unconscious conception that their lives began when mine began. And that's something I've had to do some work to become aware of and break. It's been really, really key.
Well, and I think the more we do the healing work in our relationship and can just be honest about whatever our relationship was, if we could just be honest with ourselves about it. I think by virtue of that work, my father has become more and more human, just as a default. It's bound to happen when you release your father, your mother, anybody from the level of victimization that you may have experienced. And like you said, the forgiveness is a choice, but the power of the forgiveness is so much for you in being able, when my father became human, I became more free from the person that I had envisioned him to be or thought he was in, my limited experience with him, which was through his alcoholism, through his rage and temper, which was so often due to all the stresses he had no idea how to handle and the shame and trauma that he carried. It's like the level of compassion I now have for my father and my ability to forgive him without excusing or forgetting how he treated me has been a profound gift for me, but also for my wife and my daughter and me as a father, right? So for the guys who are really committed to being the best fathers they can be, wouldn't you say, if you're not going to do the work for you, do the work for the kids that you so desperately want to be the best father for?
I think that can be a very good approach. Ultimately, I would like to see everybody do their own work for themselves.
Absolutely.
Because that ripples out in a very natural relaxed, organic way into benefit for everybody around them. But I think what you just said can be a useful entry point for men who, and I think this is true for a lot of men, that feel like everybody comes before them. They don't really deserve to heal for their own sake.
Right.
They've got to do it for somebody else's sake, which is ultimately, like I said, not where I want to see people be. But if that's what it takes to motivate them, to get them started, because these processes can be difficult. Some people really need to feel, I mean, even in my own case, I'm not married, I don't have a family, I don't have children. But a lot of the time, the work I've been doing, early on especially, I had to justify it by virtue of the benefit that I thought it could provide for other people. It's only been in the last few years that I've actually gotten comfortable with the idea that I can do this for my own benefit. And as I said, that ripples out naturally to everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, and I do think that's an important point. I mean, at some point, if you're not making that conscious decision that this work is for you, then there's a contingency that's always built into it.
Yes. And it's corrupting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's an out. It's an out. Oh, I'm doing this work for my kids, but then my kids still reject me. All right, well then fine, forget it.
Yes.
I'm doing this work to save my marriage, but my marriage ends. Fine, forget it.
I'm doing this work to save the world, and the world's still a gigantic mess. What's the point?
Yeah, that's a whole nother one, right?
Yeah. So Dan, I want to tell you about a couple of things that I think were turning points in the way I perceived my father.
Please.
And they happened at different stages in my life. Back in, I don't know what year it was, like 1989 when I was writing my first book. I was doing a lot of work with my dreams. I was having lots and lots of dreams and journaling and working with someone to help me understand the language of those dreams. And one night I had a very straightforward dream that involved a photo that had actually been taken when I was a child. On Easter, we would go to my grandparents' farmhouse, and all the families would line up one at a time on the sidewalk and have their photos taken with the giant Kodak camera or whatever they were using then. And I had a dream about a photo from one of those years where I was probably 4 years old, standing in front of my parents. My younger brother was still small enough for my mother to hold him for the photo. And I had a dream about this photo. I'd seen this photo so many times, but in the dream, I saw my father as the young man that he was. And he was probably about 5 years younger than I was at the time I had the dream. And in the dream, I didn't see the sort of angry, distant, frustrated, scary fellow that I remembered growing up. I saw a young man who looked like he was just in completely over his head. And that dream really was kind of the first shift in my ability to see him as somebody other than this big guy that just scared me all the time and made my life miserable.
That's so powerful. That, there is such a spiritual component to all of this, as much as some people may want to deny it, that there is something, whether it's in our dreams, whether it's through other media, we get those messages and we get that opportunity. Your heart was open to the idea that there was something more to your father than the person that you had experienced him as up until that point. And as a result of that, your heart, your spirit, your consciousness, God, whatever you want to call it, gave you that vision, and you took it in and saw that, wow, these blinders I've had on about my father have caused me an incredible amount of pain, but they just haven't allowed me to truly see him and who he was.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a huge, huge experience for me. And it really, as I said, that was the first big shift. I had another big shift several years later after I'd been through numerous relationships with women that had crashed and burned. I'd been engaged to the woman I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with, and it had just been a miserable situation for a couple of years and finally just disintegrated completely. And because my father was so obvious in his bad behavior, I was conditioned, I guess, to believe that he was the bad person in the relationship between my parents, and my mom was the good person. And as a result of doing some work after this relationship crashed and burned, it suddenly struck me that every relationship that I'd been in that had failed wasn't just the result of one person. It was the result of two people who each had their part in the thing not working properly, or the difficulties that came out of it, or the pain that people inflicted on each other. And that was another moment where my eyes kind of opened, and I thought, well, yeah, my dad did act pretty bad most of the time, but if I'm not to blame for all of these relationships I've been in crash and burn, and if I've learned that both people have some responsibility and contribute and kind of co-create the situation, then maybe my dad wasn't always the one who was 100% responsible for the problems in my parents' marriage. And that was another case of my view expanding, not in such a way that I just said that I just disregarded everything he did that was hurtful and wrong, but again, it humanized him. It humanized both my parents. It humanized their marriage for me. But that was as a result of me having to go through a lot of pain myself, so that I reached a point where I realized this story that I was told, where there was, one bad person and one good person in this marriage, it doesn't make any sense to me anymore.
That's a tough one for some people to wrap their heads around. I mean, I know when I got into my relationship and married my partner and everything, I was experiencing some real difficulties and anger, and, she could see it so much more clearly than I could. I had spent a lot of time looking at my father wound. I didn't understand how angry I was at my mom.
Yeah.
And I think they have to be really tied together, because it was in finally realizing, like, oh, wait a second, I love my mom. She has been there in so many ways, and she's had her own struggles and her own challenges. And to this day, she's an amazing woman who has just committed herself to me. And she didn't protect me.
Right.
She didn't get me out of the house. She didn't get herself out of the house. She didn't do more. Now, was she afraid? Yes, of course. Was she in a place economically where it was difficult? Yes, of course. And see, that's the thing. People always want to apply logic. But when you're a child, that logic doesn't matter. It's like my wife always says, our number one job is to keep our daughter safe. And when we fail to do that, it has nothing to do with her.
Right, because children live in a world of absolutes.
Right.
It's like, I'm either safe or I'm not.
Right. And we really shouldn't care. I mean, like, this is something that I think the recovery community that I'm a part of sometimes struggles with, in the sense of we always want to look for our part in everything. And the truth is, it's like, well, let's be careful here, because when a child is being abused, they don't have a part in that at all.
Yes, and the unfortunate aspect of that too is that psychologically, for the child that's being abused, the reality is kind of flipped. Because in my experience, in my reading, children up to a certain age believe that everything that happens around them is a result of something they did. They already feel responsible for things that they're absolutely not responsible for. And if we carry that thread that we started with about the unconscious having no sense of time, if you're dealing with an adult who's trying to recover from family trauma and abuse, chances are there's a part of them that already feels 100% responsible for everything that happened to them. So if you put them in a context where other people are trying to kind of shift responsibility away from the caregivers, it just sort of amplifies and turns into a feedback loop.
Absolutely. And the recovery communities and some of these other communities are really traumatized communities. I mean, these are people that are dealing with a lot more than addiction, and sometimes you can see it and sometimes you can't. And, families are complicated systems. I'm just thinking of our listeners, and a lot of women have father wounds. I mean,
oh yeah, definitely.
Women have father wounds, men have father wounds. And then we carry those wounds into our relationship. I mean, you're a woman with a father wound and you marry a guy, and chances are you've married a guy somewhat like your father. I mean, this is in heterosexual situations, but even in gay relationships, I mean, you can see that play out in certain ways. But that father wound gets projected onto men. And, so for our women listeners, what do you have to, say to them? We're talking about the men and the men with their father wounds. Is it much different for women?
Well, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is that, in my case, the fact that I had unresolved father wound and mother wound made it extremely difficult for anybody to be with me. And that says nothing about whether I'm a good guy or I'm not a good guy. That's just all about the patterns of behavior that I learned and the kind of patterns of coping that I learned to deal with bad, hurtful, painful things that happen. So I think probably the best advice that I could give to a woman who is with a man who's having difficulties and she suspects that perhaps there are some father wound issues at work are number one, for her to be very clear as she can be about what her issues are and what her boundaries are, and to take whatever action she needs to take to actually get to work on what's unresolved in herself. Because to the extent that she's able to do that, she'll be able to see her partner's behavior and his affect and his situation and his history more clearly. Because one of the biggest dangers in these sorts of situations, like the woman I was with that I talked about earlier, is that our father and mother wounds all got kind of interlocked with each other.
Yeah.
Sort of turned into, you ever see the nature films where like the two eagles are in a death match in the sky and they get their claws locked up and then they just go into a tailspin? You don't want to do that. So I think one of the best strategies for, and for the man and the woman, for both partners is honestly just know your own stuff and just work diligently to clear it and stay clear so that you don't stumble into the other person's stuff.
And I think what's important about that is we all have stuff.
Right.
Like nobody comes into any relationship without stuff. And if you can't see your stuff and if you think it's the other person, if for whatever reason your narrative is that it's the other person, no matter what. And even in really abusive relationships, obviously your first and foremost effort is to be safe.
Right.
To find safety. And at some point, you have to be able to look at yourself and be able to say, okay, now what's my stuff so that I don't have this happen again? What's my stuff so that if I decide to stay in this relationship, I can do it with my eyes wide open and fully responsible and willing to take effective, immediate action should this behavior show up again. But
right. None of this is intended to, as an indictment of somebody who's being abused.
No, absolutely not.
And even in the example you just gave, I mean, the thing that came to mind for me is it could be as elementary as a woman has been in an abusive relationship and she gets out of it, she gets to safety. Well, what next? Well, she, looks at her history, looks at her background, and it could be something as simple as, well, I'm getting into the same kind of abusive relationships that my mom was in. And all that tells me is that, as children, we look for models, and we, because we don't know how to do things, we don't know what things should look like, we look at the behaviors and the patterns around us, and we sort of adopt those as templates. And so in that case, I would say, okay, well, maybe there's a template that is unconscious that's driving you. And maybe your part of the responsibility here is to look at that template and start breaking it down so that you can build a new one so that you can move into different kinds of situations that are better.
And you talked about it earlier, right? I mean, these neural pathways that are created, if you grow up and you're in a situation where a father who has his own father wound is acting out violently and acting out abusively, and at some level you create a neural pathway that says, oh, okay, that's what love looks like.
Right.
That's what love from a man looks like. And then if that same abuse gets brought down to you, oh, that's what love from a man feels like.
Right. And people do the opposite too. They build, I guess you could call them the anti-template, which is that I'm never going to be with anybody like that.
Right.
And so the way that might get translated is male power is always abusive. It's always scary. Therefore, I'm going to avoid powerful men in my relationships. And maybe I wind up as a woman in a relationship that's not too fulfilling and not too satisfying because the guy is not connected to his own power as a man.
That's powerful too. Or I decide like I'm never going to be that way. And so I will always have the power and control in the relationship. And so you can see how some women can, and men, of course, can move into that space. And so I think part of what we're getting at is relationships are difficult. Everybody brings their stuff into a relationship. And Ernie Larson, who was a mentor to me, and some people may have heard of him, some people haven't, but he was an amazing man. He wrote over 50 books, and he wrote incredible books about relationships that people, all our listeners, should just check out. Ernie Larson, Larsen. But what he said unequivocally after 50 years of doing this work, he said, he looked at me when he knew I was writing a book about men and relationships. He looked at me and he said, Dan, it all comes down to this. The relationships that survive are the ones where both partners are willing to do their own work and own their own stuff, period. That was it.
Yeah.
That was his like final message, from years and years of looking at it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I don't have any argument with that.
I mean, it's really pretty simple. And so, and we want to complicate it, and the emotion gets in the way. And, sometimes people think I'm not very sympathetic, or I don't, understand, blah, blah, blah. But I'm like, look, man, I'm not dismissing anybody's pain I'm just saying we are all responsible for dealing with our own stuff and being responsible for how we show up. I mean,
right.
It's just that simple. I don't care what you've been through. I don't care what you're going through.
Yeah, I think that's a very concise and accurate way to put it.
Okay, so here we are. I mean, I can't believe it. We're already coming to this point where we're getting ready for our practical and tactical section. And I can't wait to hear what you've come up with around, these 3 takeaways, because this is so powerful. They're the father wounds. I mean, I know for me, my father wounds have so dramatically impacted my life and the lives of those I care the most about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have another quote I want to share with you. This is from a man named Rex McCann. He's in New Zealand, and he's been doing men's work in New Zealand for a very long time. This quote is from him. He said, "The unexpressed grief of fathers is often visited on sons."
Ooh, wow.
That's the father wound.
There you go. The grief that so many men carry that they're not given permission, and then comes out sideways against so many of fathers' children, and probably especially their sons, because then their sons are learning the same exact rules about not being emotional, not looking weak, not being vulnerable.
Right, and they carry, I think Jung said something about this too, to the effect that, every child basically inherits and carries forward the unlived lives of his parents.
Yes.
So it's about lineage.
Yeah. And Pia Melody, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but Pia Melody and her work at the Meadows and the work at the Meadows in Arizona, where I'm a senior fellow, Pia Melody just has a wonderful, wonderful framework for looking at shame and trauma. And she talks all the time about carried shame, that there is the shame that we have from our behavior, that there's even healthy shame, so that we can see the impact of our behavior and have a genuine response to it that tells us, boy, that is just not who I want to be, or that was not okay. But then she talks about the carried shame that so many of us inevitably get from our parents, and we don't realize it's their shame. It's their shame and their pain that we're taking on. And when we can see that and we can distinguish it, and we can literally give it back to them, symbolically, of course, metaphorically, of course, but when we can do that, it's such a powerful boundary that we can set up between that generational kind of combining that Rex is talking about, that intermingling of generational pain and suffering that creates so much pain.
Yes. And if you think about it, your father's father wound is from his father. So
Right.
you get that. You also get a father wound that carries through your mother from her own father.
Right.
So it builds up.
So what's the point, man? Just give me a six-pack and I'll be done.
I've had those moments.
No, it does. It can be overwhelming at times, but more, I tell you, man, as a man in recovery, as a man who's working so hard to break a cycle that, I can honestly say today, I love the father I never really got to meet.
Yes, and I can say, my father is still alive, but I don't have a relationship with him. I learned years ago, no matter how much I evolved in my understanding of him as a human being in his life, it didn't change the way that he interacted with me. And I finally reached a point. It wasn't so much a decision as just I ran out of energy. I just didn't have the energy to give him anymore. But I've continued my work because he's a part of me. And I have an internalized version inside of him that will always be with me. I really have a lot of sympathy and compassion and understanding for him. I guess my regret is I wish he could see that. But he doesn't seem to be interested or capable. I'm not sure which or both. But it's been important work, and it's helped me build a better relationship with myself, which I didn't realize was the actual object when I started this.
Yeah.
I was looking for a lot of external changes, some of which have happened and some of which have not. The one thing I really needed the most that I didn't know I needed was to improve my relationship with myself. And doing this father wound work has been an extremely, extremely important part of that. I would never want to give anybody the impression that it's too hard or it's too complicated. It's not. You and I, Dan, we've been at this for a while. We can talk about a lot of things in a short amount of time, and maybe it sounds real dense to people, and maybe it sounds hard to conceptualize. That's just the result of the fact that you and I have had years of experience with it. You don't have to have years of experience to get started.
No, what is it? The journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step. And it's really true. And I really want to emphasize what you just said, Boy, because I think it is so incredibly profound and important. Your relationship with your father has not been restored. And you continued the work. And that, I think, is so important. My father died. I continued the work. Long after he's been dead, I have a whole different relationship with my father. I have a whole different sense of freedom and happiness in my relationship with my father. And then as a result, in my relationships with other men and myself. But if we go into this work thinking that somehow it's going to automatically transform our relationship with our dads, we could be profoundly disappointed by that. But if we think it's going to transform our relationships with ourselves and the relationships we continue to create in our lives, then we'll never be disappointed.
Yes. And also I would say that this is also about healing and improving and evolving your relationship with your own masculinity.
Right. Who's the man you want to be, and how do you come to honor that space within you that's internalized your father and his pain and your pain from him, and how that affects you so profoundly as a man, I think. Right.
Yeah, because your father is the man. Literally. He's the first man. He might as well be Adam as far as you're concerned.
Right. And God and man, and I mean, yes.
So to the extent that you feel rejected, not accepted, not understood, to the extent that you feel like for whatever reason you don't measure up or you don't fit into that model, that's going to impede you as a man in your life, in your relationships, in your work, and as we've said, in your relationship with yourself.
I know you have a poem. I mean, for our listeners, Rick is a wonderful poet, essayist, really has brought art and his love of art to this work that he's done, and not just his writing, but also like essays and books that he's written, but so many poems. And you have one poem you'd like to share with our listeners that speaks to the healing around this.
Yes, I wrote this, I guess, about 4 years ago now. I'm 59, so I wrote this when I was 55. I think it expresses pretty well the state of my relationship with him at this point in my life. What's incomplete that maybe never can be complete, that just is going to be a part of me going forward. This is called My Father's Body. I need to be near him. I need to touch him. I need him to touch me. I need him to hold me. I need to be small with him. I need him to be big with me. I need to play with his fingers. I need to rest in his hands. I need to crawl all over him. I need to nip his ears. I need to pull his tail. I need him to catch me when I tumble. I need to sleep on his chest. I need to drift in his scent. I need to fall into his skin. I need to dream on his body. His body feeds me. It makes me safe. It makes me real. It teaches me how to be close. It shows me how to trust. His body makes me whole. His body is my home. His body makes my body. I hunger for it still.
That's a beautiful depiction of so many things, right? So, I mean, in bringing it into whether it was wolves or dogs or whatever it is, I mean, I think you touched that kind of universal relationship and how it exists in many ways. But just that physical need we have for love from our dads without getting corrupted by violence and abuse and homophobia and all of that other stuff. I don't want to sit here and analyze your poem because in many ways it should just stand on its own. Thank you for sharing it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And for me, it kind of wraps back around to something we started with, which is this idea that the unconscious has no sense of time. So that's a perfect example of it. That's something that came straight out of my unconscious. Some of it sounds like it was written by a toddler. Some of it's written by me in present time. That's the reality of how we experience these things. We want to be linear and we want to be rational, but the felt experience is often a mix of time periods.
And men in particular, right? I mean, with the title of my podcast is The Man Rules. I mean, it's like, and the saying is, don't let the rules rule you. And it's this idea that we are forced into a box of logic so early in our lives because the opposite is the emotion, the irrational, the more disembodied, and it's scary. And so it's scary to move into that. And it's scary to honor a poem like that without judging it, without belittling it, because it does have a childish and a childlike component. And so many men have been told to put that away, to leave that behind. If you want to, I mean, there's still that conversation that says, if you want to be the man, leave that child behind.
Yeah, and I think the real answer is to befriend that child, get to know him, and understand his needs and understand his pain, what scares him. Not so he can run the show, but so that you understand actually what's going on inside yourself moment to moment, and so that you could be a good parent to yourself, and so that you could be a proper captain of your own life and not have a bunch of toddlers running around below decks that are just wreaking havoc.
Yeah. Or as another friend of mine said in his book, not let the kids drive the bus.
Sure. Yeah, because they shouldn't.
So we're at the point of saying goodbye. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I knew it would be powerful. We could literally do 6 more podcasts and still only be touching the surface of this profound topic. But we're at the point that our listeners love, which is the practical and tactical. The 3 takeaways for our listeners, men and women, about the father wound and what can they do in their lives today to help them begin to look at this or continue to look at this?
Well, the 3 things I came up with are, I will say, are oriented toward men.
Okay.
The first one has to do with the fact that, and this was a huge issue for me when I first started my work. And by the way, I think you interviewed John Lee a few weeks ago.
I did.
John Lee was the person I started with here in Austin back in 1987. I know John Lee, and I know his great work, and I know what a great effect it's had on my life. So thanks, John Lee.
Absolutely.
When I first started, and this is something John emphasized when we were starting, I had two problems. I didn't know what I felt and didn't know how to put words to it. And I was almost separate from my body most of the time. So the first thing I would suggest to men is this exercise that I call, what am I feeling and where am I feeling it? This would be something that maybe if you do it 3 to 5 times a day, you just take a break. Doesn't matter what's going on. It could be any time when you have a break where you've got even 30 seconds to a minute. Just ask yourself the question, what am I feeling? Can you name it? Anger, fear, embarrassment, shame, vulnerability, happy, sad, whatever. And then the second question, where am I feeling it, is where in your body are you feeling sensations that are associated with that feeling that you're able to identify? And I know this can be hard at first. Even the first question can be difficult because a lot of people will just say, oh, good, or bad, But this is something that will help you around all the work that you do, but particularly around this father wound stuff, because there's so much primal emotion in our relationship with our fathers. Some of the things that I talked about in the poem, it's not rational. A lot of it's unconscious. And part of the work is to understand, if you're dealing with your father wound, if you're trying to look at that relationship, how do you actually feel about it? And one of the ways to anchor those feelings so that they're not just a mental state is to identify a place in your body. So for example, if you say, well, I'm feeling a little scared right now, where are you feeling that? Well, maybe you get some butterflies in your stomach, that sort of thing. Real simple. It's just a way to start developing those connections. The second idea that I have is, and I know not everybody likes to write. I'm a writer, so I tend toward these things, but I still think it's a good exercise, is to keep a journal for just 30 days. You don't have to even spend a bunch of time on it. Maybe write a page or two a day. And the emphasis being any thoughts and memories you have about your father and your childhood. And the idea is to do that for 30 days. Like I said, you don't have to put a massive amount of time in it. Maybe spend 5 minutes a day. If you only write one word a day, that's good enough. If you draw a picture, that's fine. If you paste in something you cut out of a magazine, that's fine. Anything will do. The idea is to look at this at the end of 30 days. And I suspect that if you do this, you're actually going to find some surprises in there. There are going to be some things that have been percolating around in your unconscious for a while that you haven't expressed that are going to show up almost as if by accident, that will give you some more insight into the relationship with your father and the state of your father wound and so forth. The third thing I would recommend that helped me a lot is to learn what you can about his life. In a lot of situations with father wounds, either as in Dan, in your case, the father's already deceased. In my case, the father's disinterested and not really available. In other cases, the father may still be alive, but completely inaccessible for whatever reason. But I found that looking at old photos, looking at his high school yearbooks, I even had him take me into his workplace one time when I was visiting my hometown, and that was very educational. He'd worked in a factory for his entire adult life, where not even 1 micron of sunlight got in there since they put the roof on. And going in there and seeing what his work environment was like every day, that really opened my eyes about what his life was like in ways that I never could have suspected. And also, if you can learn about his childhood, if you can find out what his dreams were when he was a teen or a young adult, what he was looking forward to in his life. Again, this is about expanding your perception of who this person is as a human being. And you have to do this at your own pace. If you're as angry as maybe Dan was, you may not want to do this stuff right away, or you might have to do it in small pieces. None of this stuff has to be done all at once, but if you can pick one spot and just start and kind of incrementally build up your knowledge, your understanding, your skills for yourself, then I think you can make some progress.
I just have to say, those are awesome. Those are really awesome. And while you may have had men in mind while you came up with them, I was listening for anything that really couldn't apply to women, and they absolutely, absolutely do. And I think they're really so good as even just one of them. If our listeners just practice one of those, it will be profound for you. If you don't keep a journal for 30 days, just write one. Just do one journal entry and see what that's like, or do it for a week and see what that's like, or do 1 or 2 and share them with somebody, share them with a partner. These are all great. Rick, I'm sure that our listeners are really interested in what you're doing and they want to know how to find out more about you. How do they do that?
The best source is to go to my website, which is rickbelden.com. That's RICKBELDEN.com. There's a lot of material there. It's like all my archives are there, all my writing, links to articles, information about books. There's a services page there. So there's probably enough to keep you busy for a long time.
It's a nice website.
Thank you.
Yeah, I like it. It's got a very masculine feel. It's got a very stripped down, streamlined feel that works very well and is not always the easiest to pull off. So nicely done on that, and I like the picture too.
Oh, thanks a lot, Dan.
Yeah,
glad to hear that.
I just want to say thank you, Rick, for a really wonderful conversation. I want to thank our listeners for another great episode of the Man Rules Podcast. I really hope you all are liking what we're doing this month around fathers and celebrating the journey of fatherhood and the legacy and conversation of fatherhood. And if you are enjoying it, please take the time to review it wherever you're listening, whether it's on iTunes, Stitcher, or somewhere else. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And thanks again, Rick, for joining.
You bet, Dan.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Man Rules Podcast, where we don't let the rules rule us. If you're enjoying this podcast and our guest, please take a moment to give us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever else you may be listening, and let others know about our podcast as well. If you have ideas for guests, topics, or even would like to be a guest, send us an email at ideas@themanrules.com. Check out our website and everything we're up to at themanrules.com. Because the only question we have to ask is what kind of man you want to be and what's keeping you from being that man.